Hi, everyone. Welcome to Coffee with a Counselor. My name is Jennifer, and I am on the school-based team with North Range Behavioral Health. And I appreciate you taking a coffee break with me this afternoon. Today, we're going to take some time to talk about how our child's brain develops, as well as a few strategies for you as parents when there's some emotional reactions or turmoil that comes up for our kids, on how to help them soothe and come back down to a calmer baseline based on where they're at developmentally. So go ahead and grab a cup of coffee or your beverage of choice, get comfortable, and let's chat. So I want to start our talk off today with a quote from Dr. Daniel Siegel. And Dr. Siegel has done a lot of amazing work around child brain development. He's written The Whole Brain Child as well as Brainstorm, both of which are great resources for child and adolescent brain development, respectively. And so he writes, "We now know the way to help a child develop optimally is to help create connections in her brain, her whole brain. You can call it brain sculpting or brain nourishing or brain building." And the reason I like to start off with this quote is because it really highlights the opportunity that you have as a parent to be the architect of your child's brain. And so that as their brain develops, we have the ability to help them foster healthy neural connections. So let's talk a little bit about how our brains do develop. They typically develop from the bottom to the top and from the back to the front, which means that this part of our brain right behind our forehead, which is our prefrontal cortex, is the last part of our brain to develop. And what we know about a developing brain is that for ladies, it's not fully developed until their mid to late 20s. And for gents, it's not until their late 20s to early 30s. So when we look at that information, in combination with the fact that our prefrontal cortex is responsible for our judgment, our decision-making, our critical thinking, our impulse control, and predicting consequences, all of a sudden it starts to make sense why children and teens are often not the greatest at those types of things, because that part of their brain's not fully developed well into their young adulthood. So as we consider that part, the other part of the brain that is important with child brain development that I want to talk about is what we call our corpus callosum, which is the midline. So if you ever see a picture of a brain from an aerial view, we have our right hemisphere and our left hemisphere. Our right hemisphere is usually the hemisphere that's associated with creativity and abstract thinking, while our left hemisphere is usually more associated with logic and critical thinking. Where they come together and form a line in the middle is our corpus callosum. And that midline is an information highway for our brain. And so what's important to know about the midline for our kids is that kids have a thicker corpus callosum than we do as adults, which means it takes them longer to process information. So what might this look like? It might be when you're preparing dinner and the table's set and everything's ready to go. And so you yell up to your kids, "Hey, time for dinner, turn the video games off." And you hear nothing. And it's radio silence. And so you say it again, "Hey, dinner's ready, to turn the games off, let's eat." And you hear nothing. There's radio silence. And so then you start to get irritated. It's like, "All right, if you don't turn the game off, I'm going to turn it off for you. It's time for dinner." And then your kids come back and they're like, "Wow, you don't have to yell. I heard you the first time." And she's like, "Well, excuse you, then why didn't you say something?" Part of that delay can be attributed to that thicker corpus callosum. When they get that auditory input, they get that information, it takes them longer to process that information. It takes them longer to process how they're going to respond to you and then actually put that verbal response out into the world. And so it's not that your kid's necessarily ignoring you. It just takes them more time to go through that process where it's more instantaneous for us as adults with more fully developed brains. So in talking about continuing to talk about different sections of the brain, I want to break the brain down into 3 major sections. So the first section we're going to talk about is our neocortex, which starts at the frontal lobe, and it's that outer layer that wraps around. We've got our temporal lobe, our occipital lobe, and that big outer section that encompasses or wraps around the rest of our brain. Our neocortex is our rational or our thinking brain. So it's responsible for our insight, our planning, our resilience and empathy, our imagination, problem solving, personality development, all of those higher level executive functioning items that we do as humans. The next layer underneath that is what we call our limbic system. And that's our emotional or our feeling brain. And what our limbic system does is it controls our emotions, such as fear and anger. It regulates our eating, hunger, and thirst. It helps us respond to pleasure and pain. And it helps us respond to sensory information. Underneath that, in the core of our brain and down into our brainstem, we have our reptilian complex, which is sometimes called our instinctual brain, our dinosaur brain, monkey brain, lizard brain. It goes by many names. And that part of our brain is responsible for our fight, flight, or freeze response. It's also responsible for our autopilot tasks, things like our resting heart rate, our blinking, our breathing, things that our body engages in that we don't make the conscious choice every time we blink or we breathe. And so I want to break, with those 3 sections, I want to break the brain down into an even simpler 2 sections. Because what we're going to do is we're going to combine the limbic system and the reptilian complex into one. Because both of those parts of our brains are motivated by survival. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in just a few minutes, but when it perceives a threat to our survival, those parts of our brain have the ability to override or shut off our higher level thinking. So breaking these down into just the 2 broader sections, we've got our upstairs brain and our downstairs brain. And to make it a little bit more visual for you, if we look at a wrist and a hand, the wrist into the palm is our reptilian complex, where our thumb is our limbic system, and so that folds in. And then these 4 fingers represent our neocortex that wrap around that part of our brain. And so we've got our upstairs brain and our downstairs brain. Our upstairs brain is responsible for our play, our imagination, our thinking, and our body control. Our downstairs brain is responsible for flight, fight, or freeze, and our breathing. And what we know, as I was mentioning earlier, can happen with our downstairs brain is what Dr. Siegel calls flipping our lids. And it's when our downstairs brain takes over and quite literally shuts off access to our upstairs brain so that it can keep us safe. So when our lid is flipped and when our downstairs brain takes over, if we think of an actual staircase from our downstairs brain to our upstairs brain with a door at the top, when the downstairs brain takes over, it closes that door. So it is physically impossible for our kids to access that higher level executive functioning. So an example or a scenario I like to use to kind of highlight flipping our lid is if you're at a shopping mall and you're enjoying your favorite stores, you're with, maybe your mom and some of your friends, you're having a grand old time, and out of nowhere comes a T-Rex. That's a situation where we flip our lids. And we know we flip our lids because we're not sitting there weighing the pros and cons. We're not judging and assessing the situation, wondering, would it be better for me to use the trash can or a mannequin to try and fight off this dinosaur? We're not thinking, should I sacrifice my mom or my best friend so that I can get a clean getaway? We're immediately going into an instinctual, knee-jerk, split-second reaction of fight, flight, or freeze. Fortunately for us, we live in a world where we don't have to worry about dinosaurs when we're out going shopping or doing our daily errands. However, less fortunate for us, our brains still flip our lids as though those threats are sometimes there. Sometimes our brains just get it wrong. And so I'm sure almost everyone watching can identify a time where we've flipped our lids, where we've temporarily lost the ability to emotionally regulate, to be logical. And when we settle down after the fact, it's like, oh, wow, okay, that was an intense reaction. So I think about, getting ready in the morning and you're running late for work and the one kid's not dressed, one kid's still in bed, the other kid's going swimming in their cereal bowl, and it's like herding cats. And you finally get everyone out the door and you look down at your feet and you realize that you're wearing 2 missing shoes and you just snap and you lose it. That's flipping our lids. Our kids flip their lids a lot more than we do as adults. And when our kids flip their lids, it's oftentimes over things that we don't understand. It feels like it's out of the blue or completely unrelated or disproportionate to what's actually going on in the immediate environment. And part of the reason we don't always understand what's causing our kid to flip their lids is because our kids don't have the cognitive capability to articulate what's wrong to us. And so when we look at children and we look at tantrums and meltdowns and emotional outbursts, those behaviors are the language of unmet needs. That's their way of communicating to us, hey, there's something going on with my body or my mind or my emotions or my environment that I need something else to be happening for. So when our kids are communicating that to us, when they're exhibiting those behaviors, how do we help them regulate? How do we help them close that lid back down? I think, for example, of a kid that spilled their cup of milk and has an absolute meltdown over that. We, as an objective person in the situation, can say, honey, it's okay, we'll clean up the mess, we'll pour you a new glass of milk, no harm, no foul. Unfortunately, when our kid's lid is flipped, they can't integrate and process that logical information. So that's not going to help them calm down. So let's talk about some things that might help them calm down in that moment. One is rocking. And for our smaller kids, it could be picking them up, holding them, and actually rocking, being in a rocking chair. For our older or bigger kids, where that's maybe not as physically feasible, we can put our arm around them and kind of rock them side to side, do some back rubs. But the reason that rocking can be an effective soothing skill is it actually helps us cross that midline in our brain. So when we cross that midline, we call that bilateral stimulation. And what we're doing is we're forcing information across that highway, which means we're forcing our brain to engage that higher level. And so other activities that can be helpful with bilateral stimulation are going for a walk, writing when we write across a piece of paper or we read left to right, could be playing catch and throwing a ball across body, just anything that physically engages us and gets our body to cross that midline. The next option we have to help our kids soothe relates to another idea or philosophy from Dr. Siegel. That's when we change our physical state, we can change our emotional state. Our kids do not always have the bodily awareness that we do. And so their environment can be creating overstimulation or triggers that our kids are not aware of, they're not able to identify, or they're not able to articulate to us. And so what we can do as parents to help navigate that is help change their sensory experience, help change their physical experience. So that might be a common one would be changing the temperature. If we're out sledding and it's freezing cold and it seems like our kid just hits a wall and starts having a meltdown, or on the flip side, if we're at the park all afternoon and it's super hot out and they hit that same wall, looking at, okay, we either need to warm up or we need to cool down. It can be getting a heat pack for the hands or a cold rag for across the forehead or the back of the neck. Or it could be changing other sensory experiences. If we're in a really bright area, going to a darker area. If we're in some place where there's a lot of sights and noises and smells, going to some place that's quiet and more neutral. but doing what we can to help change that physical environment so that they can change their emotional state to match. The last thing we're going to talk about to help our kids navigate or soothe is water and snacks, to ensure that thirst and hunger are not an underlying need that's triggering the lid to be flipped. As we all well know, our kids' brains are not as effective as ours. And so where we, after a long walk out in the sun, might come home and realize, oh man, I think I'm dehydrated, I'm really thirsty, I'm going to get a glass of water. Our kids are not able to necessarily identify or articulate that need, though that same need still exists. It's still there, they're still thirsty. And so offering our kid, and when I say offering, I mean physically putting out a little snack and a cup of water. Because if we ask them, do you need a cup of water? Are you thirsty? Are you hungry? They may not be in tune with their body. They may not be able to recognize that that's what's going on for them. And so taking that overwhelming guesswork out of the equation and just handing that to them. And so if you think of going for walks or out running errands, making sure you've got some waters and some non-melty snacks in the car can help make that difference between a flipped lid and a closed lid when we're out and about during our day. So hopefully today helped provide you with some information on how our child's brain develops, as well as some insight into why they might be reacting or responding in ways that seem disproportionate or out of the blue. And hopefully some of these strategies are helpful to you in the future as you help your kids navigate overwhelming emotions that come up when they do flip their lids. I appreciate you all for taking a break with me, and I hope to see you guys back for another coffee break soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself and each other, and remember that we here at North Range are here to help. If you or someone you know is experiencing a behavioral health emergency, please reach out to our crisis team at 970-347-2120 and press 2 to speak to crisis services. You can also text TALK, T-A-L-K, to 38255, or you can walk into our 24/7 crisis response building at 928 12th Street in Greeley, Colorado. Thanks so much for tuning in. Until next time.